On the last Friday night of April in Manhattan, inside a luxurious restaurant, Jonathan Miller, a lonely billionaire, sat quietly alone before an untouched plate of risotto, unaware that just beyond the iron fence outside, a 10-year-old girl had been standing there trembling for nearly 20 minutes, staring through the glass at plates of food after not eating for 3 days. Driven to her limit by hunger, she slipped into the kitchen, grabbed a piece of bread, and ran in panic when she was discovered. Disoriented, she rushed toward Jonathan's table, clutched the edge tightly, and whispered, "Daddy." And from that single, mistaken word, both of their lives began to change in a way no one could have expected. Before we begin, this is a fictional story written to inspire and uplift. At Memory Stories, we believe the right story at the right moment can change everything. The last Friday of April in Manhattan felt like a city pretending everything was fine. By 8 o'clock at night, the streets around Midtown had shifted from their afternoon chaos into something slower and more deliberate. The kind of evening where yellow cabs cut through puddles left by an afternoon drizzle, where doormen in pressed coats nodded at familiar faces, where the whole island seemed to exhale after a week of grinding forward. On East 54th Street, the restaurant called Lyell stood exactly as it had for 11 years, a long, narrow building with frosted glass panels that glowed amber from within heavy brass door handles, polished to a mirror shine, and a small brass plaque beside the entrance, so modest you'd walk right past it if you didn't already know where you were going. And that was precisely the point. Lyell wasn't the kind of place that advertised itself. It was the kind of place people got invited to, the kind of place where the maitre d' remembered not just your name, but the fact that you preferred your table near the back left corner, away from the kitchen noise, away from the bar, away from anyone who might recognize you and want to make conversation. Jonathan Miller sat at that corner table. He was 42 years old, though tonight he looked closer to 50. His jacket, dark charcoal wool custom, was draped over the back of his chair with the kind of carelessness that only comes from not caring anymore. His tie was loosened. His hair, thick and just beginning to thread with gray at the temples, was slightly disheveled in a way that suggested he'd run his hand through it several times during whatever meeting had preceded this dinner. In front of him sat a glass of Barolo, poured to exactly the right level, a bread basket he hadn't touched, and a plate of black truffle risotto that had been delivered 11 minutes ago and still hadn't been eaten. The steam that had risen from it when the server set it down had long since disappeared. Jonathan wasn't looking at the food. He was looking at his phone, not at anything in particular, not a message that required urgent response, not a crisis unfolding in a time zone 8 hours ahead. He was scrolling, thumb moving in that slow, automatic way that isn't really reading anything, isn't really looking for anything, just something to do with the hands when the alternative is sitting alone with your own thoughts in a restaurant full of other people's noise. Around him, Lyell hummed with exactly the kind of energy that costs money to create and more money to maintain. A couple at the table by the window was laughing about something, their heads tilted together over a shared dessert. A group of 6 near the center of the room was celebrating something birthday, maybe a promotion, a deal closed, the kind of celebration that got louder with every refilled glass. The bar area near the entrance was shoulder to shoulder with people who hadn't yet been seated, their voices layering over the low-string music piped through speakers, hidden in the ceiling molding. Jonathan was in the middle of all of it and completely outside of it at the same time. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face, a shadow that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite memory, but lived somewhere between the two. It lasted no longer than it takes to blink. Then his thumb kept scrolling, and his expression settled back into the careful blankness of a man who has taught himself not to feel things in public. What no one in that room knew, what no one in Jonathan Miller's professional life would have believed, given the $11 billion company he ran and the 15 magazine covers his PR team had arranged over the past 6 years, was that Jonathan had grown up with nothing. Not the kind of nothing people say when they mean they struggled a little before making it. Real nothing. The kind you don't talk about at board dinners. The kind that starts at a gate. He was 6 years old when it happened. He didn't let himself return to that memory often. He'd built an entire internal architecture specifically designed to keep it sealed. But every once in a while, in rooms like this one, in moments of quiet, that became somehow too quiet, a fragment would push its way through. A gate. Gray morning. The smell of cold concrete and cut grass. A woman holding the hand of a boy about his age guiding him toward a waiting car. The boy looking back once at the building they just left, then looking forward, climbing in the door closing. The car pulling away. Jonathan standing still on the other side of that gate, watching, not making a sound, because he had already learned by the age of 6 that making a sound didn't change anything. No one came to that gate for him. Not that day. Not the following month. Not the year after. He'd lived at the Westchester Children's Home for 7 years, before he aged out of the foster system entirely, and found himself at 16 with nothing but a duffel bag, a public library card, and a brain that refused to stop working. The rest, the company, the penthouse, the reserved corner table at Lyell, came later, much later, through a combination of obsessive drive and the specific kind of hunger that only people who've gone without can understand. But even with all of it, the company, the recognition, the money that had stopped being a real number and become more of an abstract concept. Jonathan Miller sat alone on a Friday night in Manhattan's finest restaurant with an untouched plate of food in front of him, looking at a phone screen that wasn't showing him anything worth seeing. Outside the restaurant, on the other side of the iron fence that separated Lyell's small private terrace from the sidewalk, a child was watching him. She was 10 years old. Her name was Abby. She was small for her age, or maybe she just looked small because of how she was standing. Shoulders pulled inward, one arm wrapped around her own ribs, the other hand gripping the cold iron bar of the fence. Her hair was in 2 braids that had been neat once days ago but had since unraveled at the ends into soft, tangled clouds. She wore a light pink shirt with a faded cartoon sun on the chest cotton, only no jacket, and the April wind off the East River was cutting right through it. She had been standing at this fence for almost 20 minutes. It wasn't the restaurant she was staring at, not the polished brass fittings, not the amber glow of the interior, not the well-dressed people visible through the window. It was the food. Through the glass and the frosted panels, she could see plates being carried, full plates, beautiful plates, and she could smell what was coming through the ventilation shaft on the left side of the building. Something warm. Something savory and deep and completely overwhelming when you hadn't eaten in 3 days. 3 days. 72 hours during which Abby had survived on a granola bar, found near a park bench, half a pretzel from a garbage can, outside a deli, and a bottle of water from a public fountain. Her stomach had stopped making noise about it sometime yesterday afternoon. Now, it had moved past noise into something quieter and more serious. A dull, heavy ache that made it hard to think straight, made the edges of her vision swim slightly when she turned her head too fast. Abby's mother had died 3 months ago. Breast cancer, stage 4. Diagnosed too late. Her name had been Diana, and she had been the kind of woman who made a room feel safer just by being in it. The kind of mother who taught her daughter to say, please, and thank you, to sit straight at the table, to look people in the eye when you spoke to them. Diana had tried to prepare for the worst in the ways available to her. But there are limits to what a sick woman with no savings and a husband who was already pulling away can arrange before the end comes. The husband, Marcus Webb, Abby's stepfather, had lasted 3 months after Diana passed. He'd been distant during those months, irritable, spending nights away without explanation. Then, one Tuesday morning, he told Abby to put on her shoes, that they were going to the Whitestone Mall in the Bronx, that he needed to run an errand. He bought her a soft pretzel at the food court, told her to wait by the fountain at the center of the mall, said he was going to pull the car around. Abby sat by that fountain for 4 hours. She watched families walk past with shopping bags. She watched little kids throw pennies into the water and make wishes. She watched a mall security guard walk his circuit 3 times. She ate her pretzel slowly, making it last, because somehow, some part of her already knew she should make it last. When the mall started closing, and the lights began to dim, and a security guard finally walked over and asked if she was lost, Abby looked at him and said, I think my father left. She said it the way you say something when you've had 4 hours to accept it. Since that Tuesday 11 days ago, Abby had been navigating the city on her own. She knew how to stay near subway stations for warmth, knew which bakeries put day-old bread out near the trash. In the early morning, knew that certain church steps were monitored by cameras and therefore safer to sleep on than others. Her mother had been strict about common sense and observation, and those lessons had become survival tools in ways Diana never could have imagined needing them to be. She had not cried much, not because she didn't feel it. The weight of all of it was there, sitting on her chest like something physical heaviest in the early morning, before she was fully awake, and her defenses weren't yet up, but because crying cost something she couldn't afford to spend. Energy, warmth, the particular kind of internal stability that kept her moving forward in a straight line when everything wanted to knock her sideways. She cried once on the fourth night in the stairwell of a parking garage on Lexington Avenue, with her face pressed into her knees so the sound didn't carry. Then she wiped her face with the inside of her sleeve and went back to thinking about where to go next. Her mother had told her once, in one of those conversations that felt ordinary at the time and only became significant later, that the most important thing about hard times was not whether you fell down, but whether you noticed when you were falling and caught yourself before you hit the bottom. "You'll have hard days, baby," Diana had said, standing at the kitchen sink, not making a big moment of it. "Everybody does. The trick is to keep your eyes open even when you want to close them, especially when you want to close them." Abby had been keeping her eyes open for 11 days. But 3 days without real food was 3 days. The body has limits that willpower can't override, and Abby's body was reaching its. She gripped the iron bar a little tighter and looked through the window at the plates of food being carried past, and for a moment she pressed her forehead against the cold metal and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something had shifted in her expression. The caution that had kept her moving carefully for 11 days was still there, but underneath it, pushed up by 3 days of hunger and a cold that had settled into her chest, was something else. She had nothing left to lose. Abby looked at the side entrance, the one the delivery trucks used, the one that led through the kitchen. She looked at the security guard at the front door, his back partially turned while he spoke with a couple waiting for their car. She looked at the ventilation shaft and the warm air coming out of it and the smell that was making her dizzy in a way she couldn't fight anymore. She took a breath, and then she moved. The kitchen at Liel was a machine, hot, loud, and precise, in the way that expensive kitchens have to be. Every surface was stainless steel. Every movement was purposeful. Pots moved from burner to pass in a choreography of urgency that the front of the house never saw, and in the middle of it all, everyone had a job and everyone was doing it. No one was watching the delivery door. Abby had timed it right a moment when the produce truck had pulled away, and the door hadn't yet latched fully behind the departing driver. She'd pulled it open, just enough to slip through, hugging the wall on the inside, pressing herself into the narrow space between a rack of dry storage shelves and a tall steel cabinet. The heat hit her immediately, and she nearly gasped at it. Not just the warmth, but the smell, concentrated and overwhelming after 3 days of cold and nothing. Roasting garlic, butter, something sweet and caramelized. Her mouth flooded with saliva, and her knees went slightly weak. She had one thought: bread. Find something small, something that wouldn't be noticed. She'd spotted the basket, a wire rack near the prep counter, holding half a dozen small rolls, golden brown, the kind of bread that's made fresh every hour and replenished constantly. All she needed was one, just one, and she could get back out the door and into the alley before anyone turned around. She stretched out her hand. Hey, somebody's in here." The voice belonged to a prep cook who'd turned around from the sink at exactly the wrong moment. He was maybe 25, still in his first year, and his instinct was to shout first and ask questions later. The shout carried across the kitchen like a stone thrown across still water, and suddenly everyone was turning, and the kitchen manager, a compact woman named Rosa, who ran her kitchen with absolute authority, was already moving toward the sound. Abby didn't think. Her hand closed around the roll as her body turned and she ran. She'd meant to run back toward the delivery door, but the prep cook had moved to block it without realizing he was doing it, positioning himself between her and the exit as he turned toward his manager. So Abby went the only other direction available to her, forward, through the swing door that separated the kitchen from the service corridor, then through the second door, the heavy curtained one, with the thick velvet drape, and then she was through it, and she was standing in the main dining room of Liel. The effect was instantaneous. The room didn't go silent all at once. It happened in ripples, the way sound dies in a pool when something falls into it. The table nearest the service entrance went quiet first, then the next table, then the next, until within about 4 seconds the entire restaurant had registered that something was wrong. The string music kept playing from the speakers in the ceiling. Everything else stopped. Abby stood at the edge of the dining room with a bread roll in her hand, her pink shirt damp from the kitchen heat, her braids coming loose around her face, her chest heaving. She was by any objective measure the most out-of-place thing in the room. 2 security guards, the front door guard, and a second one she hadn't seen posted near the bar, were already moving toward her from opposite sides of the room. She turned. She saw them coming. She turned again. The hunger had been sitting at the back of her skull for 3 days, like a dull pressure. And now, with the warmth of the kitchen still on her skin, and the adrenaline spiking through her bloodstream, and the lights of the restaurant suddenly very bright, it surged forward all at once. The edges of the room softened. The faces around her blurred into shapes and colors without features. Her legs felt like they were moving through sand. She was trying to find an exit. She was trying to think clearly. But 3 days of empty stomach, and cold air, and sleeping on hard surfaces had worn through every reserve she had, and in the blur of the restaurant, and the moving figures coming toward her from 2 directions, her eyes caught on something. A man, sitting alone at a corner table. Dark jacket, loosened tie, a plate of food in front of him that he wasn't eating. Abby didn't know why she recognized him. She wasn't sure she did recognize him, not exactly. Not the way you recognize someone you've actually met. It was something older and less rational than recognition. In the smear of faces around her, in the blur of the fancy restaurant, with its warm light and its people staring at her, this face looked like a face from a photograph. A photograph her mother had kept in a small frame on the kitchen counter. A picture from a long time ago, a man her mother had pointed to once, and said something Abby could no longer fully remember. Something about a good person. Something about someone who'd done something kind. It probably wasn't even the same person. She knew that in some distant, quieter part of her mind. But that part of her mind was no longer in charge. The part of her mind that was in charge right now was the part that was 9 seconds from passing out, the part that needed something to grab onto. And that face, that familiar-shaped face, at the corner table, was the only anchor in a room that was tilting sideways. Abby's legs carried her toward him. She wasn't aware of making the decision. Later, she would try to reconstruct it and fail. She walked between 2 tables, turned sideways to fit through the narrow gap between a chair and a serving cart, and then she was at the corner table, and her hand came down on the edge of it, not reaching for anything, just bracing, just keeping herself upright, and she looked up at the man sitting there. He was looking back at her. His face had gone very still. "Daddy," Abby said. And then she stopped, and then she said it differently, the way a child says it, when they're running out of everything. "Daddy, can I sit with you? I haven't eaten." The restaurant held its breath. Jonathan Miller looked at the child in front of him. The loosened braids, the too thin face, the pink cotton shirt with the faded sun, the hand gripping his tablecloth to keep from swaying, and something moved through him that he didn't have a name for. Not pity exactly. Something more complicated than that. Something older. He saw the tear that was sitting in the inner corner of her right eye, the one she was refusing with extraordinary effort. You could see the effort to let fall. And in that refusal, in that stubborn, desperate dignity, he saw something he recognized. He recognized it the way you recognize your own handwriting. Abby blinked. The blur cleared just slightly. She looked at the man she'd just called Daddy, and the face came into focus properly for the first time, and she knew immediately, completely, that she had made a mistake. The photograph her mother had kept. This wasn't him. This was someone else entirely. The jaw was different. The eyes were darker. She had walked up to a stranger in a restaurant full of people and called him Daddy and asked him to feed her. The heat of the mortification hit harder than anything else had all night. "I'm sorry," Abby said, and her voice had gone very small. "I'm sorry. I got confused because I haven't eaten in a long time, and I thought, I'm sorry. You look like someone I thought I knew. I made a mistake. I'm really sorry." She was already starting to step back, already reaching for the small shred of pride she had left, already preparing herself for whatever came next. The security guard's hand on her arm, the door, the cold outside. The larger of the two security guards was already behind her. She could feel his presence without turning around. His hand moved toward her shoulder. "She's with me." Jonathan Miller's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the specific quality of a voice that was accustomed to being listened to, and the security guard stopped moving, with his hand still 6 inches from Abby's shoulder. "Sir, I said she's with me." Jonathan looked at the guard, and then at the second guard, who had come up on the other side, and his face said very clearly that this was not a discussion. "She's a guest. Please, give us some space." The guards exchanged a look. This was not a standard situation, and they both knew it. But Jonathan Miller was a regular, and the restaurant's management had standing instructions about how to handle situations involving regulars. The guards stepped back. The watching restaurant slowly, reluctantly, began to resume its own conversations, though not fully, not all at once, because there was still something happening at the corner table that people couldn't quite stop watching. Jonathan looked at Abby. Abby looked at Jonathan. "Sit down," he said, and he said it gently, the way you'd say it to someone who might bolt if you move too fast. Abby sat down. She sat with her back very straight and her hands in her lap. Her mother had taught her how to sit at a table. Even in the chaos of the last 3 months, even in the 11 days since the mall, some things had held the straight back, the hands folded in the lap, the waiting until invited before reaching for anything. Diana had been particular about manners, not because she cared about impressing people, but because she'd always told Abby that how you treat a table tells people what you think of yourself. "You sit like you belong," she used to say, "and people will treat you like you belong." Abby sat like she belonged, even though her hands were trembling slightly, and her vision was still doing the soft, wavering thing at the edges. Jonathan set his phone face down on the table. He looked at the breadbasket, and then at Abby, and he pushed it across to her without making it a production. Abby took a roll and broke it slowly, and ate it in the careful, deliberate way of someone fighting the urge to do something different. The butter was real butter, the kind that came in a small ceramic dish with the restaurant's name pressed into it, and she used the butter knife the way she'd been taught. Jonathan watched her do this, and something quiet shifted in his expression. The server came over, a young man named Patrick, who had been at Liel for 3 years, and had therefore seen a reasonable number of unusual things, though none quite like this. And Jonathan told him to bring another menu and take his barely touched risotto back to the kitchen, to be replaced with something that had stayed warm. Patrick nodded with the professional composure of someone who was going to have an extraordinary story to tell his roommates later, and he left. "What's your name?" Jonathan asked. "Abby." She swallowed her bite of bread. "Abby Green." "I'm Jonathan." He paused. "Jonathan Miller." Abby nodded. The name didn't mean anything to her. She wasn't the kind of 10-year-old who read business news. "I know I made a mistake when I came over," she said. "I really thought there was a picture my mom had, and I thought—" She stopped, shook her head slightly. "It doesn't matter. I'm sorry I did that. I know it was a weird thing to do." "You're 10 years old and you hadn't eaten in 3 days," Jonathan said. "There's no wrong way to handle that." Abby looked at him for a moment, a direct measuring look, the kind that had probably disarmed adults her whole life, because it was more focused than children's eyes were supposed to be. Then she looked back at the breadbasket. Patrick brought a second menu. Jonathan told Abby to order whatever she wanted. Abby opened the menu and looked at it for a moment, and then said very quietly and very politely that she was not sure what some of the things were. Jonathan went through the menu with her, not talking down to her, just explaining things the way you'd explain something to someone who hadn't encountered it before. The risotto, the chicken, the pasta with the cream sauce. Abby listened carefully and chose the pasta and the grilled chicken and the roasted vegetables on the side, and said yes please when Jonathan offered her the sparkling water. They sat for a minute in relative quiet. The restaurant around them had reabsorbed itself into its own noise. Outside the window, the street traffic moved past indifferently, the way New York traffic always does. "What happened?" Jonathan asked. He asked it simply, without the loaded tone adults sometimes use when they're asking something they already have opinions about. Abby told him. She told it the same way she'd told herself the facts over the past 11 days. Not as a tragedy, because she wasn't allowing it to be a tragedy right now. Because allowing it to be a tragedy meant falling apart, and she couldn't afford to fall apart. She told it as a sequence of events. Her mother had gotten sick. Her mother had died. Her stepfather, Marcus, had taken her to the mall. He'd told her to wait by the fountain. She'd waited 4 hours. She didn't cry while she told it. She told it, looking at the table, not with shame, but with the particular flatness of someone who has already done their crying about it in private. Jonathan was quiet when she finished. He did not say he was sorry, which Abby appreciated, because people had been saying they were sorry for 3 months, and it had never once helped anything. He was quiet in a way that felt like he was actually processing what she'd said, which was different. 4 hours, he said finally. 4 hours and 23 minutes, Abby said. I counted on the fountain clock. Jonathan looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. Then he picked up his fork and started eating the new risotto that had arrived. And a minute later, Abby's pasta came, and she started eating hers too, and they ate together in a silence that was for the first time in days. Not a bad kind of silence. Abby was careful. She ate slowly, cut her pasta into small pieces, used the fork correctly, didn't rush, even though her body wanted to. The first few bites hit her stomach with an intensity that was almost dizzying, pure physical relief, the kind that makes you understand for the first time what the word nourishment actually means. She kept her face neutral. She was not going to be embarrassing about it. Halfway through the meal, Jonathan said, I know what 4 hours feels like when you're waiting for someone who doesn't come back. Abby looked up at him. I grew up in a children's home, he said, in Westchester. I was there from the time I was 6 years old. He said it the same way Abby told her own story, as a fact, not a performance. I watched other kids get picked up, get families, and I was always the one still standing there. Abby was quiet for a moment. Then, did that feel like the mall? Jonathan thought about it. Yeah, he said. Yeah, it felt exactly like the mall. They ate for a while longer. Outside, a group of people walked past the window, laughing about something, their breathmaking small clouds in the April air. Inside, the restaurant kept its warm, oblivious hum. When the plates were mostly cleared, Jonathan leaned forward slightly and looked at Abby directly. Where are you sleeping? Abby met his eyes without hesitation. Different places. Near subway stations, mostly because they're warm, and you can see who's coming. There's a church on Amsterdam Avenue where the front steps are covered by the overhang. I've been going back there when it rains. Jonathan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the bread basket, which was empty. Now Abby had eaten 3 rolls, in the careful, deliberate way she'd eaten everything else. Not rushing, not taking more than felt proportionate, which he suspected was her way of preserving some dignity in a situation that didn't offer much of it. How long have you been doing that, moving around like that? 11 days, Abby said. Since the mall. 11 days. He said it, not as a question, but as a fact he was registering, giving it its proper weight. Outside the window, a cab leaned on its horn at something. Inside, the string music kept its slow loop from the ceiling speakers. And before tonight, had anyone stopped to help anyone at all? Abby thought about it. A woman on the 6 train gave me a granola bar, she said. She asked if I was okay, and I said yes. She looked like she didn't believe me, but she let it go. She paused. I think people see a kid alone and they think someone else is handling it. Like it's not their problem to get into. Jonathan said nothing. He was looking at her in a way that wasn't pitying and wasn't clinical. It was the look of someone who was really listening, which was, Abby thought privately, one of the rarer things. Would you be willing to come stay somewhere safer tonight? I have space. He watched her face carefully as he said it. You'd have your own room. It would just be until we figure out a next step. Abby looked at him, the straight-backed, careful, measured look again. How do I know you won't do what Marcus did? And there it was, the question delivered without flinching, without softening it, just straight and clean, and directly into the heart of the thing. The table went very quiet. Jonathan held her gaze and didn't look away. You don't, he said honestly. Not right now. I can promise you I won't, and I can mean it when I say it, but you have no reason to believe me yet. That's fair. He paused. What I can tell you is that I know what it feels like to have someone leave, and I wouldn't do that to you. Abby sat with that for a moment. She turned it over, looked at it from different sides the way a careful person tests weight before they step on something. Then she nodded, slowly, once. Not because she trusted him, not yet, but because the alternative was going back outside to a church step in an April wind, and she had made herself a promise on the day she'd stood at that mall fountain that she would stay alive first and be cautious second, but that she would stay alive. "Okay," she said. The car was black and very clean, and moved through Manhattan traffic with the particular authority of a vehicle that people instinctively made room for. Abby sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes moving slowly from window to window, taking in the city scrolling past. She was not leaning back against the seat. She was sitting forward very slightly, the way you sit when you're in a place that feels too good to be real, and you don't want to get too comfortable in case it disappears. Every time the car turned a corner, she tracked the direction without making it obvious. She was doing so not because she was planning to run, but because knowing where she was had become over the past 11 days as automatic as breathing. Jonathan sat on his side of the back seat and left her space. He didn't try to fill the quiet with reassurances. He sent 2 texts on his phone, both brief, and then put it away. One of them was to his assistant Rachel Kim, whom he'd worked with for 8 years, and who had in that time become fluent in the language of Jonathan Miller requests, which were characteristically short on explanation and long on expectation. The text said, "Need a full set of clothes and toiletries for a 10-year-old girl tonight. Size small. Whatever's appropriate, bring it to the apartment by 10. Rachel would not ask questions. She would simply make it happen, which was why she had lasted 8 years. The building was on the Upper East Side, a narrow tower of glass and steel that stood between a pre-war limestone and a boutique hotel, 42 floors, the kind of building that has a lobby attendant and a key fob system for the elevators. Abby walked through the lobby looking straight ahead, her worn sneakers quiet on the marble floor. The lobby attendant, a man named Gerald, who had worked there for 14 years and had seen essentially everything, looked at Abby and then at Jonathan and simply said, "Good evening, Mr. Miller." Jonathan said, "Good evening, Gerald." The elevator was mirrored on 3 sides, and Abby looked at herself in it for a moment. Her reflection fragmented and multiplied, and then looked at the floor display above the doors, watching the numbers climb. The penthouse opened directly from the elevator into a space that was by any objective standard extraordinary. The entire south wall was glass, floor to ceiling, and beyond it, Manhattan spread out in its nighttime configuration, 100,000 lit windows, the dark spine of Central Park running north to south, the bridges in the distance stitching the island to its neighbors. The apartment itself was clean and minimal and expensive in a way that didn't advertise itself. Dark wood floors, low furniture with clean lines, a kitchen that looked barely used. Abby stepped out of the elevator and stood still. Jonathan watched her take it, in the quiet, the space, the view, and saw his apartment for a moment, the way she was seeing it. He noticed for the first time in longer than he could remember how the space echoed slightly when you moved, how there were no photographs on the walls, how the decorative plants near the window had yellowed at the edges from neglect. He'd bought this apartment 5 years ago and had never made it into something that felt like a home. He'd never thought about why until just now, standing at the elevator with a 10-year-old girl who was looking at it with eyes that registered its beauty and its emptiness in the same glance. "It's a lot of windows," Abby said finally. "Yeah," Jonathan said. "I guess it is." He showed her to the guest room, down a short hallway, past the study, a room with a wide bed and a plain, white duvet, and a window that looked out over the rooftops to the northeast. The room was clean and largely empty, which in that moment felt neither good nor bad, just neutral. A space that hadn't been anyone's yet. Abby stood in the doorway of it and looked in. She didn't say anything. "There's a bathroom through that door," Jonathan said, pointing. "You can take as long as you want. I'll see about getting you something to wear tonight." Rachel arrived at 9:52 with 2 bags. She was 33, efficient, to a degree that sometimes felt like a superpower, and she looked at the bags and then at Jonathan and asked if there was anything else she needed to know. Jonathan said no. Rachel looked at him for one additional second, the kind of look that contained a great deal of compressed curiosity, and then she said good night and left. The bag had a soft gray sweatshirt, sweatpants, underwear, still in packaging, thick socks, a small toiletry kit with child-appropriate shampoo, and a toothbrush, still in its wrapper. Rachel had added a small, stuffed bear at the bottom wrapped in tissue paper, something she'd picked up at a 24-hour pharmacy, a choice she'd made on her own. It was a small choice, and a kind one, and when Abby found it in the bag, she stood holding it for a moment before she set it carefully on the white duvet. The shower ran for a long time. Jonathan sat in the living room in the chair near the window that he usually used for reading, holding a book he wasn't reading. He didn't know what the correct behavior was here. He had run a company for 14 years. He had negotiated deals with people who'd been negotiating deals for 3 decades. He had given testimony before Senate subcommittees. He had absolutely no idea what to do with a 10-year-old child in his guest bathroom. Abby came out in Jonathan's old Tech Vision conference t-shirt, the kind given away at company events. So it came down nearly to her knees because the sweatshirt and pants Rachel had bought were right. But somehow she'd seen the neatly folded stack of old shirts on the bathroom shelf and chosen this one instead. She had brushed her hair and her braids were redone tidier, and she was carrying the small stuffed bear. She looked, Jonathan thought, like an actual child, which he supposed she was. Which it had been easy to forget somehow, watching her be so careful and so composed all evening. "Is it okay if I wear this?" she asked, holding the hem of the t-shirt. "Of course," he said. "You can have it." She almost smiled at that. Almost. Jonathan found himself at a loss in the way he hadn't expected. He knew she was tired, the circles under her eyes were deep, and she'd been awake on adrenaline and fear for God knows how long. But the gap between knowing she needed sleep and knowing how to get her there felt in this strange, uncharted evening surprisingly wide. He thought about calling Rachel again and asking her what you did with a child at bedtime, which was a sentence he never in his life expected to need to form. He decided against it. "Do you want me to read to you?" he asked, and then felt immediately uncertain about whether that was an appropriate thing to offer a 10-year-old, because maybe 10-year-olds didn't want to be read to. Maybe he had said the wrong thing. Maybe she'd look at him like he was being condescending. But Abby looked at him and said, "My mom used to read to me every night until last year. She stopped because I told her I was too old." She was quiet for a second. "I wasn't really too old." "No," Jonathan said. "Probably not." "She used to do different voices," Abby said. She was looking at the stuffed bear. "She was really good at it. She did this one voice for the bad guys that was so ridiculous. It made me laugh every time, even when I was scared." She paused. "You don't have to do voices. It's fine either way." "I'll do my best," Jonathan said. Jonathan went to the bookshelf in the study and found a copy of Charlotte's Web. He'd owned it since he was 8 and had read it twice a year at the children's home, and he carried it to the guest room and sat down on the floor with his back against the wall beside the bed, and he opened it and started to read. He hadn't sat on the floor like this in years, maybe decades. His back was going to complain about it in the morning. Abby lay on her side on the bed with the stuffed bear under her chin and listened with her eyes closed. Jonathan read slowly, unhurried, without performing it, just his voice moving through the words in the quiet room. After about 20 minutes, her breathing changed, the specific change that signals the crossing from wakefulness into sleep, slower and deeper, and he finished the paragraph he was on and stopped. He should go to his own room. He knew that was the right thing, the reasonable thing. He looked at Abby for a moment, small in the center of the wide, white bed, breathing steadily, and he got up quietly and went to the doorway. The nightmare came at 2:14 in the morning. It wasn't a sound he'd heard before. Not a shout exactly, more a cry that started as a sound of fear and became a word, several words, the way nightmares do when the body is fighting against them. Jonathan was out of bed and moving down the hallway before he was fully awake, one hand on the wall, to orient himself in the dark. He pushed open the guest room door. Abby was sitting up, her hands pressing the stuffed bear against her chest, her breath coming fast and her eyes not yet fully out of whatever the dream had been. She was saying something in a voice still mostly asleep. Something like, "Don't go, please don't go," the words cycling in the way words do when they're coming up from the deepest part of a thing. Jonathan sat down on the edge of the bed. He didn't know what to do. He was not a person who had been held when he was frightened. No one had come to him in the night at the children's home. The staff were good people, working impossible numbers. And you learned early to manage your own nighttime terror. He didn't have a blueprint for this. He only had the understanding, the deep remembered understanding, of what it felt like to be alone in the dark with something that wouldn't stop. So he stayed. He didn't touch her. Didn't speak much. Just said very quietly, "I'm here. You're okay. I'm right here." And sat at the edge of the bed in the dark, while Abby's breathing slowed from frantic to fast to manageable, while the thing that had hold of her gradually loosened its grip, while her eyes came all the way back to the room. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. "My mom," she said finally. "Just that." "I know," Jonathan said. He didn't know, not exactly, but he knew enough. He stayed until Abby's eyes closed again, and her breathing leveled out into the steady rhythm of real sleep. Then he moved to the armchair in the corner of the room, the reading chair, the one there for guests who'd never come, and he sat in it, and he did not go back to bed. When Abby opened her eyes the next morning, the room was filled with thin April light coming through the curtains, and Jonathan Miller was still sitting in that chair. His suit jacket from the night before was folded over the armrest. His eyes were closed, but his head was upright, not resting on anything, the posture of someone who hadn't slept, but had chosen to stay awake. Abby looked at him for a long time from the pillow. He had stayed. She had woken up in a strange place after a bad dream, and he had come, and then he had stayed. The whole night. She pressed her face into the pillow for a moment, not crying, she was not going to cry, but letting something come very close to crying, right up to the edge of it. Then she pulled herself back, took one breath, took another, and sat up. Jonathan opened his eyes. He looked at her and didn't say good morning with the excessive cheer of an adult trying too hard. He just said, "Good morning." "Good morning," Abby said. They regarded each other across the quiet room. Outside, Manhattan was already in motion. In here, for a moment, everything was very still. In the days that followed, the penthouse changed in small ways. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment where the apartment suddenly became something different. It happened the way a room changes when a person actually lives in it, incrementally, through small acts and adjustments, so quiet they're almost invisible. On the third morning, Jonathan found Abby standing on a chair in the kitchen, her sleeves pushed up, her hands dark with potting soil. She had found the 3 planters near the south window, a ficus, a small peace lily, and a trailing pothos, all of which had been slowly dying for the past several months, their leaves gone yellow at the edges, their soil pulled away from the sides of their pots, from too much drying and too little water. She'd located the watering can under the kitchen sink and had already given all 3 pots a long, slow drink, and she was currently pulling the dead leaves off the ficus with focused, businesslike efficiency. "They needed trimming," she said without turning around. "I noticed they weren't doing well," Jonathan said. "I didn't know what to do about it." "You just trim the dead parts," Abby said. "If you leave them, the plant uses up energy trying to fix them, instead of growing new stuff." She dropped a handful of dry leaves into the trash and inspected a branch carefully. "My mom had plants everywhere. I used to help her." Jonathan poured himself coffee and stood at the counter and watched her work, and he thought about what it meant that an apartment could have 3 dying plants in it, and the person who owned it hadn't noticed until a 10-year-old pointed it out. Later that week, a drawing appeared on the refrigerator. Abby had found a notepad in the kitchen drawer and a set of colored markers from a conference room supply bag Rachel had left in the study. She had drawn the view from the south window, the Manhattan skyline, from 42 floors, up the park's dark rectangle. In the middle, the buildings all around it. It wasn't a child's drawing in the loose, abstract sense. It was specific. She'd taken her time with it, gotten the proportions roughly right, used different blues for the sky at the top versus the building glass below. She'd hung it on the refrigerator with 2 pieces of tape, and when Jonathan saw it that evening, he stood in front of it for a long moment. "Do you draw a lot?" he asked. "I used to," Abby said from where she was sitting at the kitchen counter. Doing what passed for homework, she'd picked up a math workbook from a used bookshop near the park that Jonathan had taken her to 2 days earlier, and she'd been working through it steadily. "My mom always bought me sketchbooks. I don't have my old ones anymore." "We can get you new ones," Jonathan said. Abby looked up. She looked at him with that careful, measuring look. "Okay," she said, and went back to the workbook. Jonathan picked up his phone and added sketchbooks and drawing pencils to the list he'd been quietly accumulating. On the 5th day, he came home at 6:15 instead of 8:30, which was not his usual schedule. His COO, David Reyes, had been handling the afternoon meetings. Jonathan had texted him, "I need to leave by 6. Can you take the product roadmap call?" David had responded immediately, "Absolutely. Everything okay?" Jonathan had written back, "Yeah, just something I need to be home for." Abby was doing the math workbook at the kitchen counter when he came in, and she looked up at the sound of the elevator and said, "You're early." "I wanted to have dinner at a reasonable hour for once," Jonathan said, setting his jacket over the back of a chair. Abby considered this. "I can help," she said. "My mom taught me to make pasta." Marche. They made pasta together that night, Abby, standing on the same chair she'd used for the plants, Jonathan, across the counter from her, both of them following the instructions on the box of linguine, and supplementing with the jar of good marinara sauce. Rachel had left in the pantry as part of a grocery delivery. It was not the kind of cooking that happened at Liel, but the kitchen had warmth in it that night that it hadn't had before, and the table had 2 people at it, and the drawing on the refrigerator looked out over the whole thing. On the 7th day, Jonathan asked Rachel to research the formal requirements for emergency foster placement in New York State, and 2 days after that, he sat down across from Abby at the kitchen table. On a Saturday afternoon, she'd been working on a new drawing, one of the plants by the window, and he said, "I want to talk to you about something." Abby set down her pencil and gave him her full attention. She did this the way her mother had done it. Jonathan was beginning to notice the complete stillness, the eyes that were actually listening, and not just waiting for their turn to speak. "I've been thinking about what happens next for you," Jonathan said, "and I want to be honest with you about what I'm thinking." He folded his hands on the table. "I don't want to send you into the foster system. I know what that system is, and I know what it does to kids." He paused. "I want to talk to you about what it would look like if you stayed here, not just for a few days. Long term, officially." Abby was quiet, looking at him. Then, "You mean like adoption?" "Yes," Jonathan said. "Like adoption." "Why would you want to do that?" Abby asked. The question was not hostile. It was direct the way she was direct about everything, and it was genuine. She actually wanted to know. "You don't know me. I came into your restaurant and scared everyone and called you the wrong name. Why would you want to make that permanent?" Jonathan looked at the table for a moment. He had told almost no one. Not David, not his board, not the therapist he'd stopped seeing 3 years ago. Not any of the people who had profiled him for magazines. What he was about to tell Abby. He had kept it stored away in the same sealed place. He kept the memory of the gray gate and the car pulling away. "Because I know what it's like to grow up in a system that isn't a home," he said. "I was in the Westchester Children's Home from the time I was 6 until I was 16. I watched kids around me get families, and I was always the one who stayed." He looked at her. "You asked me why. That's why. Because I was you. I was that kid waiting at the gate for someone who didn't come, and I don't want you to have to grow up being that kid." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the city made its usual noise, a distant siren, the low murmur of traffic. But in here, everything had stopped. Abby looked at the drawing she'd been working on, the 3 plants, by the window, fuller now than they'd been when she found them. She looked at the linguine drawing she'd put up next to the skyline on the refrigerator. She looked at her hands on the table. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "and then later you change your mind, that would be worse than if I just stayed at the church steps." She looked at him. "You understand that?" "I understand that," Jonathan said. "You're sure? Not just right now sure, like actually sure." "Abby," Jonathan said, and he said her name the way he meant it. "I am sure." "You're sure? Not just right now sure, like actually sure." "Abby," Jonathan said, and he said her name the way he meant it. "I am sure." She looked at him for a long moment. The way she searched his face had a quality to it that reminded him of someone checking whether ice would hold their weight before stepping onto it, pressing on every part of it, checking the edges, not taking the surface for granted. He let her look. He didn't rush it, or soften it, or try to make it easier with words, because he understood that the looking was necessary, that it had been earned by experience, and that the only honest thing he could give her right now was to stay exactly still and let her decide. "My mom told me once," Abby said slowly, still looking at him, "that you can tell something about a person by what they do when they think no one's watching." She looked down at the table. "You stayed in the chair all night. I was asleep and I Didn't know you were there and you stayed anyway." Jonathan didn't say anything. "She said that's when you find out who someone really is," Abby said, "when there's no audience." She looked back up at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, the measuring quality in her eyes had given way to something else. Not certainty, not yet, but the beginning of it, the first crack of light under a door. "I think she would have liked you." Jonathan felt something shift in his chest in a way he didn't have words for, and didn't try to. Abby nodded one small, deliberate nod. Not a leap of joy, not a dramatic embrace. A choice, made clearly, with her eyes opened by a child who had already learned the difference between being told something and it being true, but who had decided, looking at this man across this table, that there was enough here to build something on. "Okay," she said, and she picked up her pencil and went back to drawing. Jonathan reached out across the table and turned her drawing around to look at it properly. The plants had grown. "These look better already," he said. Abby didn't look up, but the corner of her mouth moved, and this time, it actually became a smile, small and private and real. 6 weeks is enough time for a life to find its shape. Abby started school at PS 158 on East 77th Street, a 20-minute walk from the building or 12 minutes by the car Jonathan sent when the weather was bad. She wore a backpack that Rachel had helped her pick out, and she carried a sketchbook in the front pocket of it. And on the third day, she came home and told Jonathan at dinner that a girl named Priya, who sat 2 seats ahead of her, had asked to see what she was drawing and had said it was really good. "Did you let her see?" Jonathan asked. "Only one drawing," Abby said. "I'm still figuring her out." Jonathan smiled. "That's reasonable." He was home for dinner 5 nights out of 7 now, which David Reyes had noticed and privately decided was an improvement. Jonathan was still running Tech Vision, the company didn't stop, because a CEO's life had changed shape. But he had restructured his day, reorganized his calendar, pulled back from the meetings that existed only to validate decisions that had already been made. He moved with more purpose now in and out of the office, and back home, and the people who worked for him noticed without commenting on it. They had a routine. Abby had breakfast while Jonathan had coffee and answered emails. She left for school. He left for the office. He was back by 6:30 at the latest. Abby had homework on the kitchen counter. They made dinner, or Rachel sent food from a place nearby that knew their order. They ate. Jonathan sat nearby, while Abby read or drew, and he did his reading too. Reports that he used to read at midnight were now read at 9, which was better for the reports and better for everything else. On the 43rd day, the article came out. It had started 3 weeks earlier, with a call from a journalist named Maya Torres, at a publication Jonathan had respected for years. She had explained her angle a piece about the rising conversation around childhood poverty in New York City's wealthiest neighborhoods, the invisible crisis right next to the visible abundance. She'd mentioned Jonathan as someone whose background might provide a useful perspective. Jonathan had spoken to her for 40 minutes about the Westchester Children's Home, about the foster system, about what the city's social services landscape looked like from the inside of it. He'd mentioned Abby without using her name, thinking it would stay that way. It mostly did. The article ran under the headline, "The Other Side of the Window," and it was a careful, serious piece of journalism about wealth and childhood poverty in Manhattan. The photograph that ran with it was of a well-dressed man visible through a restaurant window, shot from the outside, abstract enough to be anyone. But the story the article told, the CEO, the children's home, the girl who'd walked into a restaurant after 3 days without food, had a specificity to it that cut through, the kind of specificity that travels. The article was shared 1.4 million times in the first 24 hours. By the second morning, it was on the front page of 3 major news aggregators, had been picked up by 4 television networks, and had generated a comment thread of several thousand entries that Jonathan's communications team was managing as though it were a product launch. Jonathan himself had stopped reading the coverage by noon of the first day. He had seen what happened when a story got that kind of momentum, and he knew that the attention was finite and would pass, and his instinct was simply to wait it out. He did not know, on that first morning, that a man in the apartment in Flushing, Queens was reading the article on his phone over coffee. Marcus Webb was 44 years old, thick through the shoulders, with a face that had the specific quality of someone who had always relied on being more intimidating than he was. He'd met Diana Green 5 years ago at a bar in the Bronx, had married her 14 months later when she'd been diagnosed and frightened and needed help she couldn't afford to pay for. He'd moved in, contributed some household income for a while, pulled away gradually as the illness progressed and the medical bills mounted, and departed completely, symbolically, if not legally, within weeks of her death. The mall had been a practical decision. He could not keep paying rent for himself and a 10-year-old child he hadn't fathered, and he had no intention of entering the foster system as an official placement. So he'd made the practical decision. He hadn't thought much about Abby since, until this article. He read it 3 times. He read the part about the girl. He read the part about the billionaire and the adoption process. He read the part that the journalist had included as a heartwarming detail with no sense of what it would set in motion, that mentioned a trust fund Jonathan Miller had quietly established in the child's name. Marcus set his phone down. He looked at the wall of his apartment. Then he picked the phone back up and called a lawyer whose number he'd had for years, a man who had helped him with a couple of matters that didn't bear examination. He described the situation and asked a simple question: if he were the last legal stepfather of a child who'd just been connected with a billionaire's money, did he have any standing? The lawyer told him he might. Marcus sat with that information for a moment, turning it over the way he turned over most things. Not emotionally, but practically. He was not a man who felt guilt in any way that inconvenienced him. He had done what he'd done at the mall because it had been the practical solution to a practical problem, and he had moved on from it with the efficiency of someone who had learned early to keep his own accounting clean. But now, the accounting had changed. Now, there was a number attached to Abby's name, a real number, the kind that could make a meaningful difference to the specific shape of his life. And the practical solution to the practical problem looked different than it had 11 days ago. He showered, dressed, and took the subway into Manhattan. Jonathan was in a meeting when Gerald called up from the lobby, which Gerald never did, under any circumstances, ever to say that there was a man in the lobby claiming to be Abby's stepfather and demanding to come up. Jonathan's chest went cold. "Tell him to wait," he said. "I'll be right down." He stepped out of the conference room and walked to his assistant's desk. "Pull the security feed for the lobby," he said. "Right now." There was a tablet mounted on the wall near the elevator that showed the lobby feed. Jonathan carried it to his office, closed the door, and looked at the image. The man in the lobby was heavy-set, wearing a gray jacket, leaning on the front desk, with the specific posture of a man who expected to get what he wanted. Gerald was speaking to him with the practiced calm of someone who was not going to be moved. The man said something, and Gerald shook his head. Jonathan looked at this image for a long moment. Then he walked down the hall to the guest room, where Abby had gone after school knocked, and said quietly, "Abby, I need to show you something." He handed her the tablet. Abby looked at the image on the screen, the lobby, and the man leaning on the desk. She had not seen Marcus Webb in 43 days. The shock of seeing him now, even through a screen, even without him looking at her, was something she hadn't prepared for. The blood went out of her face. She sat down on the edge of her bed with the tablet still in her hands, and her fingers went white on the edges of it. "That's Marcus," she said. Her voice was flat and very quiet. "That's my stepfather." Jonathan sat down beside her. "He came to the building. He says he has rights." Abby looked at the screen for another long moment. Marcus was gesturing now at Gerald, and the gesture was the kind that meant escalating. She knew that gesture. She knew all of Marcus's gestures, the language of his impatience and his entitlement, and seeing it on a screen was enough to bring back the cold of a mall fountain and the weight of 4 hours and 23 minutes of understanding. The tablet trembled in her hands, not slightly. She was shaking from somewhere deep, from the place where the nightmare came from the place the aching 4-hour wait lived. She pressed the tablet against her chest so she didn't have to look at the screen anymore, and she put her face down, and she shook. Jonathan reached over and took the tablet gently from her hands. He set it face down on the bed and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "He is not coming into this building. Do you hear me? He's not coming up." Abby nodded without raising her head. "And I'm going to call my lawyer right now." Abby nodded again. Jonathan stood, and before he left the room, he looked back at her once, small on the edge of the bed, arms wrapped around herself, the stuffed bear, from the first night sitting on the pillow behind her, and something moved through his expression that was not complicated. It was clear, and it was certain. and it had been building for 6 weeks without his fully noticing. He took out his phone and called his attorney. The first hearing was on a Thursday. Jonathan's attorney was a woman named Catherine Hale, 52 years old, 28 years of family law, the kind of lawyer who had heard every version of every argument and whose value was in knowing exactly which of those versions would hold up under scrutiny. She had reviewed the situation in an evening and come back to Jonathan the following morning with a clear summary. Marcus Webb had a legal basis for contesting the adoption proceeding. The marriage to Diana Green had been registered and legally valid. Webb's name was on no criminal record that was discoverable, and the abandonment at the mall, real provable by Abby's own account, was not provable by anything else. No security camera had covered the food court entrance where Marcus had walked away. No one had seen it happen. Abby had been found 2 weeks later, a borough away, and there was no documented chain of events between the 2 points. Marcus, through his lawyer, a man named Briggs, who had the specific quality of someone who worked on contingency for clients who promised large recoveries, was arguing that he had been Diana Green's legal spouse, that he had therefore been Abby's legal guardian, and that he had never voluntarily relinquished that guardianship. He was not claiming to want Abby back for reasons of affection. Nobody in the room, with 2 working eyes, believed he was claiming that. What he was claiming with considerable legal precision was custody, and behind the custody claim was the trust fund, and everyone in the room knew it. The first hearing went badly. Marcus's lawyer presented the marriage certificate, the joint utility bills from the apartment, Diana's death certificate, and a statement from Marcus, in which he described the day of the mall visit as a misunderstanding, that he had gone to find the car and had a medical episode in the parking garage, that by the time he recovered, Abby was gone. The statement was smooth and detailed and completely invented, and Catherine could not prove it was invented because there was no evidence to the contrary. Abby sat beside Jonathan through the hearing, in a gray dress that Rachel had bought, her hands folded in her lap, her back very straight. She had not cried. She had looked at Marcus once when he came in, and then she had moved her eyes away and not looked at him again. When she was called to speak to the social services evaluator after the hearing, a woman named Dr. Fisher, who had kind eyes and careful questions, Abby told her everything. The day of the mall, the 4 hours, the 11 days on the street. She told it clearly and without omission, and Dr. Fisher wrote for a long time on her clipboard. But the evaluator had told Catherine afterward quietly that a child's verbal account of abandonment without corroborating evidence would be difficult to make determinative on its own in a contested proceeding. Children's accounts were taken seriously. They were not alone enough. Catherine drove back to the office and sat at her desk for a long time. Jonathan was at the kitchen table that evening when Abby came and sat across from him. She didn't speak for a moment. She looked at the plants by the window, which had been doing well new growth on all 3 small green shoots reaching toward the glass. "Is it going to be okay?" she asked. Jonathan looked at her. He had always been honest with her, and he intended to keep being honest with her. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'm not going to stop." Abby nodded. Then, "Marcus doesn't want me. He's just doing this because of the money." "I know. He never wanted me. Even when he was married to my mom, She stopped. She looked at her hands. "He wasn't unkind to me, exactly. He just wasn't there. Even when he was in the room." She paused. "My mom knew. She didn't say it out loud, but she knew." Jonathan listened. "She would have hated this," Abby said quietly. "She would have hated that he's doing this." She looked up. "My mom was really smart. She thought about things carefully." "She sounds like she was," Jonathan said. Abby was quiet for a moment longer. Then she pushed back her chair and said she was going to do homework, and she went to her room, and Jonathan sat at the kitchen table with the plants at the window and the drawing on the refrigerator and thought about a woman named Diana Green, who had raised a daughter like Abby, and thought about what it meant to be that careful about the people you leave behind. On the 9th day, after the first hearing, at 10:14 in the morning, Jonathan's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He was in his office. He almost didn't pick up. The man on the other end introduced himself as Robert Calloway, an estate attorney practicing in Queens, and he said he had been following the news coverage of Jonathan Miller's adoption proceeding. He said he believed he had something that might be relevant to the case. He said his former client, a woman named Diana Green, had come to his office 7 months ago before she died and had asked him to prepare and notarize a document on her behalf. Jonathan was standing very still by the time Calloway finished his first sentence. "She came to me in September," Calloway said. "She'd just been given a prognosis. She knew she wasn't going to survive." She was very composed. "She said she wanted to document certain things formally, with proper legal weight, because she was worried about what might happen to her daughter after she was gone." "Why didn't you come forward before?" Jonathan asked. He was not accusatory. He genuinely wanted to understand the sequence. "Because I didn't know where the child was," Calloway said. "Diana gave me instructions to locate a specific individual as a preferred guardian, someone she'd known years ago before her marriage. But after she passed, the child wasn't in any system I could find. She was just gone. I've been looking for 8 months." He paused. "The article told me where she was." The document arrived at Catherine Hale's office by courier that afternoon. It was 14 pages, notarized at every turn, drafted with the precision of someone who had known she had one chance to get this right. Diana Green had written in her own words and her own name a comprehensive account of her marriage to Marcus Webb, the financial manipulation, the emotional withdrawal, the growing absences, the pattern of behavior that a family court would recognize as neglect and coercive control. She had noted specific dates. She had noted specific incidents. She had written clearly and with legal specificity, "It is my expressed and documented wish that Marcus Webb be denied any and all custodial rights to my daughter, Abigail Green, in the event of my death." She had named the preferred guardian she'd hoped to find. She had named a backup provision in the event that person couldn't be located. And at the bottom of the document, in what looked like a different pen, added, "Catherine, suspected on the last possible day." Diana had strength enough to hold. One was a note in smaller handwriting. Not legal language, just words. "Abby, if you ever read this, I did everything I could think of. I'm sorry I couldn't do more. You are the bravest person I have ever known. Please, let someone take care of you." Catherine read the document twice at her desk, and then called Jonathan. "We have her," she said. She did not mean it triumphantly. She said it the way you say something when a person who can no longer speak for themselves is finally being heard. A mother who knew she was running out of time and spent what little she had left building a shield for her daughter. If this story is moving, you share it with someone who needs to be reminded that love doesn't end. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time, because stories like this one deserve to be heard. At the second hearing, Catherine presented the document. She did it without theatrics, simply laying it before the court as what it was: a sworn, notarized, legally constructed declaration by the child's legal next of kin, executed with full capacity, making her final wishes for her daughter explicitly clear. Briggs objected, of course. He argued the document's timing, its origin, its chain of custody. The judge, a woman named Judge Patricia Okafor, who had been sitting family court for 17 years, listened to the objections and then asked Catherine several specific questions about the notarization and the witnessing process. Catherine answered each question precisely. Then Catherine introduced the second piece of evidence, the results of a background check Jonathan's investigative team had quietly commissioned 2 weeks earlier. Marcus Webb had been collecting foster care subsidy payments from the state of New York, payments issued in Abby's name for Abby's support for 3 months after the date of his own statement, claiming she had disappeared from his care. He had not reported her disappearance. He had continued to collect the payments. The state's Department of Families and Children had initiated a fraud investigation 2 weeks prior. The room was very quiet when Catherine finished presenting. Judge Okafor looked at Marcus Webb's lawyer for a long moment. Briggs looked at his client. Marcus looked at the table. "Mr. Webb," Judge Okafor said, "is there anything you would like to add?" Marcus did not say anything. The ruling came down 40 minutes later after a brief recess. Judge Okafor denied Marcus Webb's petition in full, cited the notarized declaration as dispositive, referenced the ongoing fraud investigation as collateral evidence of character and intent, and transferred full guardianship of Abigail Green to Jonathan Miller, pending the completion of the formal adoption process. Jonathan was sitting next to Abby when it was read. He felt her hand find his arm and grip it, just for a moment. Not the grip of celebration, but the grip of someone who has just been told that the ground they're standing on is real. Later in the car, going home, Abby sat looking out the window at the city moving past. The afternoon light was flat and pale, the kind of light that makes Manhattan look like a photograph of itself. She was quiet for a long time, and Jonathan let the quiet sit, because he had learned by now that her silences were thinking silences, and not uncomfortable ones. After several blocks, she said she knew. She planned for it. She did, Jonathan said. She knew Marcus was going to try something. She knew him well enough to know, Jonathan said. She didn't leave things to chance. My mom was like that, Abby said softly. She always thought ahead. When she got sick, she started teaching me things, not school things, practical things. How to read a bus map, how to ask for help without sounding desperate, how to spot a person you could trust. She paused. I didn't understand at the time why she was teaching me all of that. I just thought she was being extra careful. She looked at her hands in her lap. She was getting me ready. She knew she wasn't going to be there. Jonathan looked at the city outside his window. She was protecting me, Abby said quietly. Even after. Jonathan looked at her, at this girl, who was Diana Green's daughter in every possible sense of the word. Yeah, he said softly. She was. Abby turned back to the window. She was quiet for the rest of the ride. But she did not let go of her grip on his arm. The adoption was finalized on a Tuesday in October. There was no party. Jonathan had offered one a dinner somewhere nice, something to mark the day, and Abby had thought about it for a moment and said she'd rather just come home. So they came home. Rachel had left flowers on the kitchen counter, which was all the celebration the kitchen needed. Sophia, the housekeeper who came twice a week and had, over the course of the fall, become the closest thing to a steady constant in Abby's daily world, outside of Jonathan, Sophia, who kept chocolate biscuits in the cleaning supply cart, and who had once spent 45 minutes helping Abby braid her hair in a new pattern she'd learned from YouTube, had made a pot of jollof rice, which was apparently Abby's current favorite thing in the world. They ate it at the kitchen table, the three of them, and talked about a math test Abby had that Thursday, and a deal Jonathan was closing with a company in Austin, and whether the peace lily was going to flower, which Sophia was confident about, and Jonathan was skeptical about. It was a completely ordinary dinner. It was the best dinner Jonathan had had in years. The months that followed had a rhythm to them that Jonathan hadn't known how to have before, and it turned out the thing he'd needed was to be needed on a schedule. Abby had school 5 days a week, which meant 5 mornings of walking to the elevator together, 5 evenings of figuring out dinner. She had homework, which she did with focus, and occasional frustration about fractions. She had Priya, who had become a proper friend by October, and who came to the apartment on Saturdays at first, looking wide-eyed at the penthouse, and then gradually treating it as the place where she and Abby lay, on the living room floor with their sketchbooks, and argued about which musicians had the best sense of color. Abby was getting better at sleeping. Not every night, there were still bad ones, still dreams that brought her upright and gasping in the dark. But they were less frequent now, and when they came, she knew what to do. She knew Jonathan would hear her and come down the hall. She knew he wouldn't make a big production of it. He'd sit, and he'd stay, and in the morning they'd both pretend it was a normal night, which somehow made it easier. Jonathan stepped back from the daily running of Tech Vision that November, promoting David Reyes to COO, with a new title and a mandate to handle the operational decisions that Jonathan had been handling himself for 14 years. He still ran the company. He still had meetings, still made decisions, still carried the weight of the thing he'd built. But he left the office before dinner. He went to parent-teacher conferences with the same preparation he used to bring to earnings calls. He sat in the front row of the school's winter concert and filmed it on his phone with the excessive dedication of every other parent around him. "You're filming it sideways," Abby told him afterward, looking at the footage. "I'll figure it out by the spring concert," Jonathan said. "That's optimistic," Abby said. He had never in his life been called optimistic before. One evening in February, Abby came into the living room carrying a small, framed photograph. It was a picture of her mother, Diana, at maybe 32, standing in a kitchen, laughing at something off camera, her hair down her eyes bright. It was the kind of photograph that shows you who someone was when no one was watching. Abby walked past Jonathan to the bookshelf on the far wall of the living room, the one with the books and the few impersonal objects that had always been there, and she cleared a space on the second shelf and set the photograph there. She stood back and looked at it for a moment. She didn't say anything. Jonathan looked at the photograph. He looked at Abby. She would have liked the plants, Abby said finally. I think she would have, Jonathan said. She was really particular about plants. Abby's voice had the careful quality it always had when she talked about her mother, not closed off, not pained, just careful, precise, wanting to get her right. She said you could tell what kind of person someone was by how they treated their plants, whether they paid attention, whether they noticed when something wasn't doing well. Jonathan looked at the peace lily, which had, as Sophia had predicted, and he had doubted flowered that week, a single white bloom on a long green stem opening in the direction of the south window. What does a flowering plant tell you? He asked. Abby turned and looked at him with the straight, measuring look that had first thrown him off balance at a corner table in Liel. Then she looked at the plant and at the photograph, and she almost smiled. That someone's paying attention, she said. She went back to her room to finish a drawing she'd been working on, a big one, the biggest she'd done, yet a full cityscape from memory, with every building she could name placed in its right position on the skyline. Jonathan could hear the scratch of her pencil through the door. He sat in the chair by the south window for a long time. Outside February. Manhattan was doing its usual February things. Gray sky people bent forward against the wind on the sidewalk. 42 floors below, the park trees, bare and dark against the pale color of the afternoon. It was not a beautiful day objectively. It was a normal day in a city that had 10,000 of them every year. But in the apartment, there was warmth, and a plant that was flowering, and a drawing on the refrigerator, and the sound of a pencil through a bedroom door. And Jonathan Miller sat in the middle of all of that, and did not reach for his phone. On a Saturday morning in late March, almost exactly 1 year from the night at Lael, Jonathan and Abby were standing on the building's rooftop terrace. Jonathan had found out the building had a rooftop access when he moved in and had never once used it. Abby had found out from the maintenance staff from a man named Eddie, who fixed the elevator, and had taken to bringing Abby an extra granola bar when he came because she had once helped him hold a door open without being asked, and he had remembered it, and she had been asking to go up for 3 weeks. They went up after breakfast carrying coffee for Jonathan and hot chocolate with extra marshmallows for Abby, wrapped in jackets, against the March air. Manhattan at this hour was extraordinary, the kind of morning when the light comes in low and gold from the east, hitting the buildings at an angle that makes the city look like it's been built from copper and glass, and something barely possible. From 42 floors up, you could see everything, the park, the river, the bridges, the whole sprawling, complicated, beautiful thing. They stood there for a while in the morning cold, not talking much, looking at the city. Abby had her sketchbook with her. She almost always had her sketchbook, and she'd made a few quick marks in it before tucking it under her arm and deciding the looking was better than the drawing, at least for now. She'd been working on a series of drawings of the neighborhood around the school building by building, and Jonathan had suggested framing them, which had made her think about it with that careful, deliberate expression she wore when she was taking something seriously, without wanting it to show. After a few minutes, Abby wrapped both hands around her cup and looked up at Jonathan. She had grown 1.5 inches since October, and Sophia had observed this with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who felt personally responsible for it. She had new braids today, done in a pattern she'd learned herself with the help of a mirror and a YouTube tutorial. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Yeah," Jonathan said. "That night," Abby said, looking back out at the city, "when I came into the restaurant, I wasn't thinking clearly. I was really dizzy and everything was kind of blurry, and I saw you sitting there by yourself, and I thought—" She stopped. She turned, her cup in her hands. "I thought you looked like someone from a picture my mom had. Someone she said was a good person." She paused. "I knew I had the wrong person, pretty much immediately after I said it. But you stopped the guards, and you sat me down, and you gave me food, and I kept thinking—" Another pause. "I was sure I had the wrong person. I made a mistake." Jonathan was quiet, watching the city. "But then," Abby said, and her voice was quieter now, not performing anything, just saying the thing she wanted to say. "I don't think I was wrong. Not about the important part." She looked up at him. "That night, I called you the wrong name, but it turned out to be the right name." Jonathan looked at her. He looked at this girl who had walked into his life through a kitchen door with a bread roll in her hand and called him the wrong name, and somehow in the process of doing so, called him exactly the right thing. He put his hand on her shoulder. She leaned into it slightly, the particular lean of someone who has decided all the way down to the deepest part of them that this is a safe place to rest. They stood on the roof together, looking east at a city both of them had survived, and the sun kept coming up, and the light kept changing, and below them, Manhattan moved and breathed and kept going in the way it always does, indifferent and enormous, and somehow, from up here, also small enough to hold. The kid, who had waited alone at a gate, and the girl who had waited alone at a fountain standing side by side on a rooftop in the morning light. Jonathan thought about the gate sometimes. He always would. It was part of the architecture of him, foundational, not removable, the thing everything else had been built on top of. He had once thought of it only as a wound, a fact of deprivation, the origin point of the hunger that had driven him through 16-hour days, and one acquisition after another. He had not until recently considered that it was also the thing that made him able to see what he'd seen in Abby's eyes at the corner table of Liel. Not pity, recognition. The same wound, recognizing itself. He wondered sometimes what Diana Green would think of all this. Whether she would be satisfied, this woman, who had loved her daughter enough to sit in a lawyer's office in Queens, while she was sick, and dictate a 14-page document into existence, against the day she could no longer fight on her own. He thought she would have questions, careful questions, the kind her daughter asked, the same habit of mind, traveling down the same blood. He thought she would have watched him for a long time before she said anything, and he thought eventually she would have approved. Abby finished her hot chocolate. She looked at the empty cup and then at the city, and then back at Jonathan with an expression that was not quite mischief and not quite contentment, but somewhere between the two, a face that had not had room for that particular expression 1 year ago and was still getting used to wearing it. "Same time next Saturday," she said. Jonathan looked at her. He looked at this rooftop that he had owned for 5 years and never once stood on. He looked at the city he had built his life in, which looked different from up here than it did from inside the meetings and the deals and the earnings calls. He looked at the morning. "Yeah," he said. "Same time next Saturday." Neither of them had to wait anymore. Jonathan didn't save Abby that night. They saved each other. One empty seat, one hungry child. One decision to say she's with me, and two broken people found their way home. You never know which small moment will be the one that changes everything. Sometimes the person who walks into your life at the worst possible time is exactly who you both needed. If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe, so more stories like this can reach someone who needs them today. And tell us in the comments, has a stranger's small act of kindness ever changed your life?